Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining this seminar. Today we will have a talk from Silvia Pianta that works. She works at CMCC, in particular at the European Institute on Economics and the Environment. And today she will talk about the paper. This is an empirical paper that tried to assess the link between a large-scale natural disaster and green support. But before I let her talk, I would like to introduce a little bit very quickly CMCC, because I know that there are speakers and attendees that are external to CMCC. So CMCC is a research center that mainly deals with studies the interaction between climate change and society. We rely on a large network from IPCC, the YAMC, or the various institute that deals with energy, climate, and the environment. And then we do have the mission to advance climate research through multidisciplinary analysis. We combine climate modeling, impact assessment, and environmental economics, and then we try to support science-driven adaptation and mitigation actions. How we do that? We do have a quite complex infrastructure, which is made by 3 different research institutes that are multidisciplinary with respect to one another. We rely on 4 strategic programs. We rely on a computing infrastructure that is dedicated to study climate change. And finally, we do have 2 specialized centers on digital innovation and high-level education and training. So about the institutes, these are the 3. One is the Institute for Earth System Predictions. The other one is the Institute for Climate Resilience, and finally the European Institute on Economics and the Environment, where Silvia is dedicated. As for programs, the 4 are: one dedicated to the carbon cycle, the other one is dedicated to analysis of global cost, a 3rd one on prediction of socioeconomic impacts of climate change, and finally we do have a program that tries to integrate artificial intelligence and machine learning into the modeling chain. The 3 centers that I mentioned, one is a high-performance computing center. We do have an advanced digital innovation center, and finally we rely on a training and education center. This is my last slide before I hand to Silvia. A little bit of rules. We deactivated both the audio and the video. So if you need to do questions, please use the Q&A tab in the Zoom session. And in terms of rules, she has a 40 minutes presentation. So the idea is to have this question and answer session at the end. But if you really have some doubts and you need to ask something, you can still use the Q&A session during the presentation. So I stop sharing. And I hope Silvia can.
Okay, so I activated my audio, which I hope works. And then I'm going to share my screen. You see it, okay? Full screen now. Here. Okay, so thank you, Cristina, for the introduction. And I will present here a paper, which is joint work with Paula Rettel, who's a political scientist originally from Brazil. And we focus here on the impact on natural disasters on support for green political platform, focusing in particular on the case of Brazil, which is a country that's very important in terms of global environmental preservation and climate change action. And we are currently revising the paper, so we hope to get useful feedback and comments from you. Okay. We focus in particular on wildfires in Brazil. As you know, Brazil is one of the countries that has been increasingly hit by wildfires in recent years, but it's not the only one. We've saw very recently in the Los Angeles area, but also different areas in North America, including Canada, have been hit by very dangerous and impacted wildfires. And this also happened in, for instance, in Australia. And these wildfires are, climate scientists tell us that are getting more frequent and more severe due to climate change. So these are complex events where we have anthropogenic factors shaping and increasing the probability of these fires. These include land use practices, but also weather variation. And since we have this increased frequency and severity of extreme events, wildfires, but also hurricanes, or floods, the academic community has started to ask the question, does this direct experience with these extreme events increase the probability that people support environmental policy and climate policy in particular, since these events can make really clear what are the costs of these events and environmental degradation in general. So we try to contribute to this literature in general, which is a literature that comes from different disciplines, psychology, political science, economics, and we focus on a country that is not has not been studied that much, but is really important, and this is Brazil. So we try to understand what are the political consequences of natural disasters. We look in particular at support for green candidates, and I will tell you more about the Brazilian political context, but in particular, we will focus on support for Marina Silva, who's currently the Minister of the Environment in Brazil, but ran as a presidential candidate. So we can see what it was the impact of wildfires on support for Marina Silva as a president. And Brazil, as I said before, is one of the countries that has been hit more severely by these wildfires. And this is particularly dangerous in Brazil because wildfires destroy crucial ecosystems like the Amazon, but also the Pantanal, that are really important for climate change, let's say addressing climate change, but also limiting, for instance, biodiversity loss and other environmental issues. And Brazil is a particularly interesting case because it is very important for the globe, for environmental preservation of global environmental resources, but also is a country where environmental issues are actually pretty salient. They also have a lot of indigenous communities that still live in forests, for instance, and so these things are actually pretty salient in the media. And so we thought that studying the case of Brazil was particularly important. I will give an overview of the academic literature that, as I said before, comes from different disciplines that started to try to understand what is the impact of direct impact of temperature abnormalities, extreme weather events, and disasters on environmental attitudes. And for instance, there are some papers led by psychologists that have seen that direct experience with extreme events increases attention to climate change. For instance, this paper by Matt Cisco has shown that people tweet more about climate change in the United States when they are directly exposed to extreme events. And also temperature abnormalities. So directly experiencing temperature that is in particular higher than what we perceive as normal increases climate change concern. There is also a paper with Matt Cisco again, where we've seen that temperature abnormalities also increase media coverage of climate change. And then there are different studies, again, focused on the United States that show that temperature abnormalities increases the belief in the reality of climate change. And this is particularly an issue in the United States, where we know that there are higher levels of climate skepticism. And also these temperature abnormalities increase climate change concern and willingness to support climate policies. So we have this first step of impact of these events on attitudes, so what people say they think, but we might care even more about the impact of these events on actual behaviors. And one of the most consequential behaviors that we can enact is actually political behavior. And this can be, for instance, voting behavior. So the type of parties that we support at the ballot box. And so within the political science literature, that there is, in the last 5 years, I would say, an increasing number of studies that tries to understand what is the impact of extreme events on political behavior, which can be either support for green parties or, for instance, voting in favor of environmental referenda. And so there are a series of studies. Again, all of these focus on high-income countries that look at the impact. For instance, there's a series of studies that look at the impact of floods on voting behavior. So this paper by Baccini and Lehmann looks at the impact in Switzerland of floods and sees whether being directly affected by flood increases the probability of supporting an environmental referendum. And they find that actually this is the case, but this effect is particularly concentrated among people with high levels of education, and also this effect vanishes over time. So if we had a flood more than, I think, 6 months or 6 or 8 months before the referendum, the flood does not have any impact. So there is this idea that these disasters can open a window of opportunity for climate action or environmental action, because when we have these disasters, people think more about environmental issues that might be more likely to support environmental policy. But these effects are often short-lived. And then we have other papers also looking at floods. As you might remember, in 2021, we had very damaging floods in Germany, and there are 2 papers that look at the impact of floods in Germany on support for the Green Party, and they find that there's a very small increase in support for the Green Party in areas that have been hit by floods. We also have some papers that look at the impact of wildfires, like we do in this paper. This paper by Hazret and Mittelberger finds that wildfires in California increase support for environmental referenda, but this in the US context happens only in areas with a previous democratic majority. So it looks like if there's a Republican majority, we know that Republicans are less likely to be supportive of environmental action. The Republicans are not somehow convinced of supporting more environmental policy when they have this direct experience of extreme events, while Democratic voters, they actually might shift to, they might have an somehow baseline higher environmental concern, and there's this concern increases with this direct experience with disasters. And we also have similar evidence from the case of Australia. We have interesting one study that is not focused on the US, but on the European Union, this paper by Hoffman and co-authors, and they find that extreme events and temperature abnormalities increase not only environmental attitudes and climate change concern, but also support for green parties across European countries. And finally, we might also wonder what happens to parties, right? So do parties talk more about climate change or environmental issues when we have a higher incidence of these extreme events? And this paper by Vappenans actually finds that across Europe, we have parties talking more about these issues when the, let's say, the districts the politicians come from are hit by disasters. So we have all this evidence, but there's a focus on high-income countries. And with this paper, we try to focus on a country of the global south that's really important for global forest preservation and climate change action. And we try to contribute to this literature on how environmental shocks impact political behavior. There's somehow an open question in the literature because we've seen that this experience with extreme weather events increases environmental concern and support for green parties, in particular among left-wing voters. But there's actually a paper focusing on the case of the Vaia storm in Italy. This is a storm that hit the northeast of Italy, I think in 2018. And they actually find that in that case, being areas hit more severely by Vaia actually supported more the far-right climate skeptics incumbent that was the Lega in that case. So actually it doesn't seem like it's always a mechanistic effect with more extreme events and more support for green platforms. There are some contextual dynamics that we should take into account. And so even if we want to have an optimistic view, that let's say we look for a silver lining, we have this increased severity of extreme events, but this will lead people to support climate action or environmental action more. We don't know whether this is the case, and there are complex economic and social structures that shape the direction of this effect. And so we try to understand not only whether this effect exists, but also what explains the heterogeneity of these political responses to extreme weather events. And we try to make the argument that a key driver of possible divergent responses to extreme weather events is the distributive implications of disasters. So the cost and benefits in this case of environmental disasters, but also of environmental and climate policy, fall unevenly across different social groups. So there are papers that show, as we might expect, that people working in polluting sectors or high emission sectors support less climate action less, or people that have more polluting lifestyles also are less supportive of climate action. But we also argue that also in the case of extreme events, the way the cost and benefits of extreme events are distributed changes the way that these events impact political behavior. So in general, we know that extreme weather events increase the salience of environmental issues, but we might have two effects. They might increase the salience of the long-term benefits of environmental policy, or the long-term negative effects of not doing environmental policies, but they can also highlight for some people the short-term cost of environmental policy for those of them that might be directly bearing this cost. And this somehow connects to this literature, starting from the political scientist Englert, that stresses how material self-interest, so whether we gain or lose from different policies, shapes our political attitudes. So our key argument is the following. Extreme weather events provide information on the cost of environmental degradation, so we might have this increased support for green political platforms, but at the same time, extreme weather events can remind that green policies can be a challenge for carbon-intensive economic activities and way of life, and so in some cases, among some subpopulation, they can actually decrease support for green political platforms. And this depends on the specific consequences of specific weather events in a specific context. So, for instance, in the case of Brazil, I don't know if I mentioned this, yes, in the next slide. If we focus on the case of larger scale fires in Brazil, of course, fires contribute to the greenhouse effect and contribute to climate change. And so this is a global public bad. They also create negative local environmental effects. Exposure to smoke increases respiratory and cardiovascular disease. So there are some costs that are clearly both local but also global. And there are also some local costs that are connected in particular to communities that rely on standing forest resources. And these can be indigenous communities, but not only. But in the case of Brazil, fires can actually create benefits for some groups. For instance, they clear more land that can be more easily grabbed. And in general, they create more land that is available for, in particular, soy, farming, and cattle ranching. And these are very important economic activities in some areas of the country. And so we will argue that basically the reliance of different areas on soy farming and cattle ranching shapes the way that the incidence of wildfires impacts voting behavior. But in different, let's say, if we think about different extreme events and different socioeconomic contexts, we might have different groups of winners and losers somehow. So it's always important to take into account the specific context. Before starting, I will give an overview of green politics in Brazil, or the political, let's say, the panorama in Brazil. Most of you are probably familiar with the Workers' Party, which is the party of the current president Lula. And this is somehow the most historic party and is the key party that actually has a clear programmatic platform. So traditional socialist left-wing party. But most parties are actually not programmatic. So somehow the constellation of parties changes very often. They very often depend on the personality of specific politicians. And then the focus of parties on environmental issues in particular changes a lot over time. We will focus in this case in particular on the 2018 elections, where we had, at the time, Lula was in jail. He has now been acquitted and is now president, but he couldn't run. So we had Haddad that was a candidate for the Workers' Party. And then we had Jair Bolsonaro, who created this, had joined just recently a very small existing parties that had very strong support. And as you remember, Bolsonaro ran clearly on an anti-environmental platform. And then we also had Marina Silva, which is actually an historical figure. She was born in a family, a very numerous family, very big family of rubber tappers in the state of Acre in Brazil. And she very early started to be a prominent environmental activist. She led protests together with Chico Mendes. And then she was elected and she started a political career. And for some time, she was part of the PT, the Workers' Party. But then in 2008, and she was also Minister of the Environment. But then she started having some conflicts with the government, in particular with regard to issues related to biofuels and dams, and also and GMOs. And so she left the government and she left the party. And then in 2013, she created a new party, Rede, the Sustainability Network, and she ran as a president. In 2018, she was a presidential candidate. So we have a case where we have a clear environmental voting somehow. So people who supported Marina Silva were really in support of environmental policy. So we can interpret support for Marina Silva as a support for green political platforms. To recap, we have the following expectations. We expect that large-scale fires increase Marina Silva's electoral returns, but this effect decreases with an increase of the economic reliance on cattle ranching and soy farming. So we will look at these average effects, but also these heterogeneous effects depending on the local economic structure. To run this empirical analysis, we employed different sets of data. We use data made available by INPE, which is the Brazilian NASA, and we basically develop a daily data set at the municipality level. So we know whether each day each municipality was hit by a fire, and then we can construct different measures of fire activity in terms of intensity and time limits. Then we use weather data, again made available by INPE, and in particular we look at short and long-term trends in precipitation, wind, and temperature. And then to look at this heterogeneous effect, so whether the effect is different in areas that rely more on soy and cattle, we use labor market data. This is a very rich data set called RICE, made available by the Brazilian government, that tells you the share of people, people that are employed that work in different sectors. So we have a measure of each municipality's reliance on soy and cattle, depending on what the share of people that work in these sectors. Then, of course, we use Brazilian electoral data, and then we perform all this analysis at the municipality level. What is a bit challenging in this context is to find a convincing way to really be sure that we are measuring the impact of fires on voting behavior. And this can be a bit challenging due to the fact that fires, even more than other extreme events, do not happen completely at random. As I said before, they are influenced by anthropogenic factors and weather conditions. And so we use two different identification strategies to try to address this: an instrumental variable strategy and a difference in different strategy. I will give you more details on the two strategies soon, but just to give you an intuition, in the IV strategy, basically we exploit the fact that climatic factors can affect the probability and size of fires. And basically we exploit exogenous variation in fires caused by temperature and wind to convincingly identify the causal impact of fires on voting behavior. And I will give you more details on this soon. And instead, in the difference in differences strategy, this is an econometric strategy that compares different groups of municipalities. Some groups are hit by fires in the week before election, and some are not. Basically, if we can argue that whether municipalities are treated, so hit by fires or not, in the week before election is random, and if we can argue that these municipalities would have had parallel trends, so things would have been proceeding in a similar way in the two groups, if not for the impact of fires, then we can argue that the difference between these groups is due to the impact of fires. So we have a treatment groups that are municipalities that have fires in the week before elections, and then a control group that are municipalities that have no fires in a longer pre-election period, and then we also test the impact of different variables here. But this is just to give you an intuition of the methodological strategy that we use. So the first research question concerns the average treatment effect, the average effect of fires. What is the average impact of fires on green voting? And to do this, with instrumental variable strategy, we employ a rather complex specification that tries to, as I said before, exploit exogenous variation in short-term weather that impacts fires in an exogenous way. But we control for other long-term weather patterns that might impact voting behavior through channels different from fires. To recap this, for those who are not familiar with this econometric strategy, these instrumental variable strategies employ some instruments that impact the treatment. So we use temperature and wind in the week before election that are, we can say, exogenous, that cannot be controlled. And these things, they have to be, let's say, these instruments need to be relevant. So we have to show that these instruments impact the probability of fires. And we find that this is the case. Another requirement for these instrumental variable strategies to be valid, to be reliable, is that we have to be sure that these instruments impact our outcome, so voting behavior, only through the treatment. So there are no other channels. And there's a lot of concern that whether trends actually can impact voting behavior. And so what we do is that we only exploit short-term variation in weather in the week before election, but we control for long-term weather patterns that might impact voting behavior through channels different from fires. So for instance, if we have very dry conditions in the previous 4 years, this impact economic development, and this can at the same time impact the choice of different candidates. So we control for this possible, this is an exclusion restriction violation. And then we also control for precipitation on the election day that can also violate this exclusion restriction because it has been shown that people vote less when it rains. And so basically precipitation on the election day impacts turnout. So to recap, we have our outcome variable, which is the vote share of Marina. Our main treatment variable is a measure of fire activity in the week before election. And we do all this analysis at the municipality level. And then we use as an instrument wind and temperature in the week before election. And as controls, we have these long-term weather patterns that are average precipitation and temperature in the last 5 years before the week before the election, so before the treatment period, medium-term deviation from historical precipitation patterns, and then precipitation on the election day. And finally, we control for micro-region fixed effects. These micro-regions are equivalent to commuting areas in the United States, so they are bigger than municipalities, but not that bigger. These are areas that are similar have similar socioeconomic conditions, and this allows us to control for unobserved factors that are constant over time in each microregion. So increases the reliability of our results. And then we have standard error clustered at the microregion level. So these are the IV results. So in the first column here, we show results of a normal OLS regression where we don't use this instrumental variable strategy. And instead, the second column is where we use this instrumental variable strategy. And we use, in this case, as a treatment variable, a binary variable that measures whether a municipality was hit by a big fire in the week before the elections or not. And we find that this increases by 7 percentage points the probability of the vote share of Marina Silva. We use different measures of fire activity and different time windows. For instance, this is a binary variable that we use just to make the coefficient more interpretable. So we can really say this increases by 7 percentage points the vote share of Marina Silva, but we also show that our results are robust to using alternative measures of fire activity constructed in a continuous way or with different data sources. And we also look at the impact. In these main specifications, we look at fires in the week before elections, but then we also look at fires in the 2 weeks before election, month before elections, and so on. And we find that actually, let's say, the shorter time windows have bigger effects. So also, similarly to what was found in other papers that stress this recency effect, we find that fires just before election have a stronger impact because then they make environmental issues more salient in the mind of voters. Second, as I mentioned before, we use a second empirical strategy, which is this different in different strategies that compares municipality hit and not hit by fires in the week before election. So our outcome variable here is the vote share of Marina Silva in the first round of the presidential elections. And then we have our treatment variable, which is equal to 1 if the municipality was hit by a fire and 0 otherwise. And in this case, we have a different set of controls that allows us to control for other possible unobserved variables, so phenomena that we might not be observing. And we have municipality fixed effects that control for unobserved factors that are constant over time, but different in different municipalities. Year fixed effect that control for different things that might happen every year affecting equally all municipalities. And then we also control for state year fixed effects. So these are different trends for different states over time. So for instance, one state might have different trends of economic development, and this might impact voting behavior we control for this. So this is our difference in different strategy. And here are the results of the specification. And here, basically, this is the impact of being hit by a fire in the week before the 2018 elections. And we see here that the third coefficient is positive and significant. And basically, this shows that also with the specification, we find that fires increase support for Marina Silva. We don't have a significant effect for 2014, and this is what we want, because we want to show that municipalities hit or not hit by fires in 2018 were not different in 2014. So that these municipalities actually have parallel effects. Here we also use different definitions of the treatment and control group, and I can provide more details later if people are interested. The second big research question focuses more on heterogeneous effects of fires. So does the impact of fires on green voting differ in areas with different degrees of reliance on soil and capital sectors? And I show here the instrumental variable results first. So again, here we have in the first column a normal OLS, more standard OLS regression. And in the second column, we have the IV specification. And here we have the main variable, the treatment variable fires, and we interacted with this measure of reliance on soil and capital sector. And we find that actually this coefficient is negative, which means that while on average being hit by a fire increases support for Marina Silva, in areas that rely more on cattle and soil production, this effect is smaller. So these areas that actually benefit from fires do not increase the support for Marina Silva. These are the results for the difference in difference strategy, and we find similar results. So here, let's say the dark line, the black line is the treatment effect in 2018. And basically we find that the higher the share of people employed in soy and cattle production, the more negative the impact of fires on support for Marina Silva is. And this, let's say, the dashed line with this light gray confidence interval is the impact in 2014 that, again, we don't want to have, because this is just to show that these municipalities hit and not hit by fires in 2018 were identical, similar in 2014. What we try to do also here, because some people might be reasonably concerned that actually there are different things that are correlated with employment in soy and cattle sectors that might actually be driving these effects. So areas that rely more on soy and cattle production might be more conservative, for instance, no? And so the heterogeneous effect might not be driven by soy and cattle employment, but they might be driven by the differences in ideology. And to address this, we basically run some robustness checks where we control for the interaction between fires and these alternative moderators, in particular ideology, and we find that our results are robust to increasing this, to adding this further controls. So we think this can help us make a statement about this share, let's say, material interest and reliance on soy and cattle being an important moderator of the effects. A final step that we implement is trying to understand a little bit more the individual level mechanisms, and we use survey data for that. And so we find these effects on average across different municipalities, but we want to understand a bit more what might be happening behind this. And there are different mechanisms that have been discussed in the literature. There are some psychological mechanisms that have been studied in particular by psychologists that are, for instance, affect activation or decreasing psychological distance. And these mechanisms basically say, whenever we are directly impacted by these disasters, we have affect activations on negative emotions, or we have this decrease in psychological distance, so we feel that we are psychologically closer to climate change and we're more concerned. So we might have this psychological explanation, or we might also have what we might call a cost-benefit mechanism. So natural disasters provide information about the impacts of environmental degradation, and so they increase the salience not only of the cost of environmental degradation, but for some people also the benefits of environmental degradation. So they increase the salience of this trade-off between the health environmental cost of environmental degradation and the economic cost of preserving natural areas where we have some restricted economic activities. And so we wanted to see whether we could test this mechanism a bit. And we actually don't argue that one exists and the other doesn't. We think that both exist, but we also try to argue that this cost-benefit mechanism is an important part of what we find. And we struggle a bit to find good data for this, but finally we found a survey that was collected in 2021 in Brazil. And this was a collaboration between ETS Rio and the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, that for those of you who are not familiar with it, basically collects a lot of very rich survey data on climate attitudes. At the beginning in the United States, but now they cover a lot of different countries. And so they collected this survey data in 2021 in Brazil. And this was a sample of 2,600 Brazilians with quotas for geographic region, education, gender, and age groups. And then we also have information on the municipality where people resided. So we could also connect this survey data with information on whether these people were directly impacted by fires in their municipality. Unfortunately, we don't have the exact day when the survey interview was conducted, so we cannot look at the impact of fires exactly in the week before the interview, but we can look at the impact of fires in the month before the data collection period. This is the best we can do with this data. But this data can be interesting because it allows us to test a bit more this cost-benefit mechanism, because we have one survey item that asks people, to what extent do we agree with the statement that fires in the Amazon are necessary for economic growth? And we think that this can somehow measure this material self-interest somehow. And so we have this hypothesis that we test with the survey data that experience with fires decreases the perceptions of fire's contribution to economic growth in areas with low levels of employment and in soil and capital sector. So just very briefly on the specification, we look at the impact of fires. We interacted with the share of people employed in soil and capital sectors. And then we have a series of individual level controls, so respondents' age, gender, education, and a series of municipality level controls like GDP per capita, the share of forest area, the population, and the share of people employed in agriculture. And very briefly, here we plot the impact. On the x-axis, we have the share of people employed in soy and cattle. So we find that actually in areas where we have more people employed in soy and cattle production, we actually have a higher impact of fires on the agreement with the statement that fires are necessary for economic growth. And so this is somehow suggestive evidence that this cost-benefit mechanism might be contributing to the effects that we found. So to conclude, we try to contribute to the literature that tries to understand the political consequence of extreme events and natural disasters. And we think this is very important because unfortunately we have increased frequency and severity of these events, and trying to understand whether these might facilitate climate action or support for environmental policy or not is really important. We focus on the case of fires in Brazil, that we said before is very important for global environmental preservation and climate action, but also for biodiversity, because actually Brazil is very rich in biodiversity. And we basically find that also in this context, extreme weather events increase support for green candidates, but this effect is conditional on the distribution and the cost and benefits produced by disasters. And in the case of Brazil, we argue that the main effect is related to employment in the soy and cattle sectors, but in other contexts, we might have different distribution of cost and benefits. So in general, the conclusion that we can draw is that whether or not this direct experience with environmental degradation and climate impacts help to create green constituencies depend on how environmental impacts and policy solution interact with individual material self-interest. So whether people individually bear some costs or benefits. For some people, the short-term cost of environmental degradation outweigh the long-term benefits. And in general, this is further evidence in support of the importance of studying distribution implication of environmental phenomena and environmental policy to understand what are the consequences in terms of environmental and climate action. So that's it. Thank you. Thank you, Silvia. No. Okay, so hopefully you can hear me from also online. Okay, so yeah, this is actually a very good point because actually while the share of people employed in cattle and soy production is measured pre-treatment, actually is not completely exogenous. So what we try to do to address this concern is first test the impact of further controlling for other theoretically motivated moderators. So I was mentioning before the case of ideology, right? What are other things that actually might be correlated with cattle and soy employment in cattle and soy production that might actually be driving the effect. So we control for the interaction of fires with pre-treatment ideology. We also control for the impact of fires interacting with a series of socioeconomic development indicators and of the interaction with the share of people employed in agriculture. So we try to do this in order to address these possible concerns. We reflected a lot on whether it was possible to employ some exogenous variation also in the mediator, but we basically had a hard time finding it, so we try to do the best we can by controlling for things that we can theoretically think might be polluting our effects, basically.
Okay. I hope that answer.
So then we can also
satisfies.
discuss
Yeah.
more. Yeah.
Okay. And then there is another question. Basically, the question says, considering the outcome of these and other studies available, what is your take on regarding the main obstacles for Greens and green-leaning parties in terms of reaching much better electoral response?
Okay. I would say one policy implication is that these disasters can open a short period with higher, let's say, openness by the public. So this so-called window of opportunity, where people start to be more concerned about the direct impact of environmental degradation. They might be more somehow open to supporting green candidates in this case. And in general, in terms of political communication, I think more can be done in order to make people understand how these disasters are in particular impacted by climate change and why this tells us that this as evidence that we should support climate action in order to avert this negative impact in the future.
Okay. There is another question about the type of fire. I mean, you mentioned some robustness, maybe you already have the answer. But so the fire regimes of tropical systems are determined by both ecological and land use factors. You don't distinguish the origin of fires. I presume fires in cattle-dominated communities are more likely to be due to land practices. Do you think the effect you see might be due to the different origin of fires?
So this is a good point, and this is exactly what we try to do with the IV strategy. So the IV strategy basically allows us to isolate the exogenous component of fires that's due to changes in short-term weather. So this is somehow a way to distinguish between these two and be sure that we're really looking at the causal impact of fires that are exogenous, that are not directly caused by them.
Okay, and then the same person asks how these results can fit into modeling. So how would you use results to improve our ability to model the economic response to a changing climate?
That's a good question. I would say one thing that could be done is, for instance, try to incorporate this political response to extreme events in modeling. For instance, we might think about some scenarios where we have this impact of extreme events, increasing the probability of implementing more ambitious environmental policy. But then, as we try to argue in the paper, then whether we have this increased support for environmental policy or climate policy depends on contextual factors. So I think this is in general one of the challenges of incorporating empirical evidence into modeling, right? Because in models, we have to make some simplifying assumptions. But yeah, it would be something that would be interesting to think more about.
Okay, so far no other questions from the tab. So you don't see them, but there are a lot of people here. If you have questions, maybe speak up so the audience online can hear.
I can repeat the question.
Yeah, okay.
I have a question. So there's this whole debate about the elites. So the elite being the bearer of the value of the environment. So the environment is a luxury good that we are protecting for them. So So how does your heterogeneity analysis fit to this problem? And in particular, I'm not totally sure, you would expect that when you're hit by an extreme event and you're suffering from that, it's very hard to convince you that it would make more salient the cost of the protection rather than the cost of the damages from the environment. But if that's what you're finding. So what do you think is the mechanism there? Basically that, I mean, does that go through a narrative of the problem? Are politicians telling the story? Fires are, you know, protecting you from the fires would require a lot of cost. You've already suffered from the fire. Let's not protect us from, what is the story there? I cannot, it's very hard to understand how you spin that, but apparently they were able to do that also in the north of Italy, so can be done.
Yes, so I will just recap.
No, you don't need to. They
Isn't
hear,
clear?
yeah.
Good. So on the first point you raised was this idea of elites, like the environment being a luxury good. And I think we could debate a long time on that, because I think this is less the case, for instance, in the case of Brazil, because there we have a lot of people that actually depend on the environment for their livelihood. So just to say that I think this is something probably it's true more in high income countries, but it can depend. But then the final question you were asking is, I think, was concerning more the role of the supply side, so the politicians, no? So for instance, the role of narratives can be very important, and connecting to the question before, like environmentalist parties can maybe make some efforts to control the narrative in order to really make the connection between environmental degradation and costs more salient. But very often other types of parties are more somehow successful in driving the narrative. And for instance, in the cases of the German floods, there was some anecdotal evidence that actually in some areas we don't find this effect of increased support for green parties, because actually in that case it was the conservative politicians that went where the floods hit and really kind of made the population feel more seen and also somehow control the narrative. And the Green Party didn't do this, for instance, right? So this is also something they could have done, to go there and try to explain things and control the narrative a bit more. I don't know if this was the question.
Okay. One last point. So you're now, if I understood correctly, looking at the whole, within the couple project, looking at the manifestos, so the parties' manifestos, and trying to, and did work in singling out how they treat the topic of climate change. So my question to you would be, can you now look at whether parties are more capable of showing climate change not as an ethical issue or an ideological issue, but as an economic issue? Because apparently that would be more successful as a strategy. Can you do that with the work done with that?
So this is something we could do. So basically, this is joint work also with Mary Sanford here in the room. And we have, because we didn't do this, but we can do it because we already have a way to identify when parties talk about climate change, and then we could differentiate these different narratives. And this can be done either qualitatively or with this structural topic modeling that are more computational approaches. And I think there are strengths and weaknesses of the two approaches, and we can discuss more about this. But I think, probably highlighting more the costs and benefits is something that, or costs of environmental degradation or the benefits of environmental policy is something that maybe can be done in particular in this geopolitical context.
There is one final question online. Maybe in 1 minute you can answer. Have you checked for geographical variation in your results? If fire's immediate consequences are local, this could give you some idea of who's getting the cost close to fire zones and who's getting the benefits.
far, but not benefiting from economic activity.
I don't understand is if whether,
I mean, the fire you measure is local.
yeah, the fires are at the municipality level. And so we actually, yeah, we argue that these effects that we're seeing are local. And so these people are actually getting the costs, but also depending, like what we try to argue is that whenever we have fires, we have costs, okay, in economic costs, but also health or environmental costs. But in some areas, we also have more benefits in these areas. We measure this at the municipality level. We also try to control for possible spatial spillover, so we control for the fact that it's not fires in neighboring municipalities that are driving the effect. But I'm not sure I really got the point, so I'm happy to discuss
Yes,
more
I
with
mean,
John.
He's an internal person. So we can do that.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we can close. Thanks again for this nice presentation. And,
Okay. Thanks, everyone.